Imagine facing just this relentless torrent of 150 active violent crime cases. You're constantly on the road, pushing yourself to the absolute limit, trying to help desperate families, and it all leads to a life-threatening physical collapse. What kind of work drives someone to that brink? And, well, what kind of person does it take to recover and keep going?
That's a really powerful way to start. It sets the stage perfectly because the human cost described in this book, it's immense. It really highlights the pressure on those early agents who are, forging this whole new field.
Absolutely. And it wasn't some kind of detached academic thing. The book makes it clear that for a long stretch, there was just one person in the behavioral science unit handling active cases full-time. Just one.
One person for about 150 open investigations across the entire country.
Yeah, think about that workload. The book mentions maybe 125 days a year traveling out of Quantico.
Constant flights, hitting the ground in places like Alaska or Seattle, dealing with completely overwhelmed local cops, then turning right back around. And the pressure, it wasn't just the number of cases, was it?
No, not at all. The book really emphasizes that the real weight came from the desperation, from local departments, communities living in fear, and, maybe most profoundly, from the victims' families. That deep empathy. It was a driver, sure, but it also added so much to the psychological toll.
And that relentless pace, combined with the emotional weight, well, it had severe physical consequences. The book talks about experiencing this free-floating anxiety, feeling really terrible out in Seattle, and then eventually just collapsing.
And it wasn't just burnout, was it? It was viral encephalitis, brought on, or at least made much worse, by that sustained stress and weakened state.
Falling into a coma, waking up paralyzed, struggling with slurred speech, that painful throat from the life support tube. I mean, it was a genuine brush with death.
What's really striking reading the book is the contrast. This immense personal sacrifice and then the apparent lack of institutional support back then.
Yeah.
There's a clear bitterness expressed towards some people in the Bureau.
Yeah, even citing an assistant director telling the author something like, they'd have to do something until you drop, before the need for more resources would even be recognized. There was even official censure over just a comment in a newspaper.
Right. And then you contrast that with returning to Quantico in 1984 after recovery.
Yeah.
The book describes walking into a room, 50 profilers from field offices there, and getting this spontaneous, genuine standing ovation.
That moment, feeling cherished and appreciated, like coming home, it really speaks volumes about who truly understood and valued what was being built there.
Thinking about the darkness of those cases, the trauma, the human cost described in the book, it's intense stuff.
Right.
Really intense.
It absolutely is. And it's the kind of material that, well, it requires some real processing, thoughtful consideration.
Definitely. And that need for reflection is something we actually lean into. It's one reason we use tools like AI book analysis in our mindful moments on our YouTube channel. Yeah, it helps us, and hopefully you too, to kind of sit with these complex, often difficult ideas from books and other materials, to inspire that critical thinking and reflection needed to really learn from them.
That makes sense. So, moving from that heavy personal toll, the book then takes us to the professional beginnings. Late 1970s, the behavioral science unit was mainly teaching. Right. Their main course was heavily based on academic psychology.
But there was this growing realization, and the book details this, that the academic studies, while foundational, just weren't giving law enforcement the practical tools they needed. Not for catching violent offenders now.
Howard Teeton's course on applied criminal psychology, shifting the focus to motive. That was an early Klein post.
And the book shares this really fascinating, maybe surprising, early parallel. See Auguste Dupin in Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Right. The argument being that Dupin was maybe history's first behavioral profiler. And the story itself is an example of using a proactive technique, getting inside the perpetrator's mind.
So the shift became less about abstract theory, more about, rigorous, methodical field studies. The core idea, as the book puts it, was simple. To truly understand why violent criminals did these horrific things, you had to go directly to the source.
You had to talk to the offenders themselves.
Exactly. And that led to this strategy of interviewing incarcerated violent criminals. The big question they were trying to answer, according to the book, was just why they do this stuff.
What makes them tick? What are their techniques? What could be learned that might help catch others, maybe even prevent future crimes?
And the examples in the book, they're incredibly revealing about what came out of those interviews. Take Charlie Davis, the part-time ambulance driver.
Okay, what did they learn there?
Well, his interviews didn't just reveal his technique, strangling victims, then chillingly calling it in himself and responding to the scene, but his underlying motivation. It was this profound need for control, orchestrating every part of the event, even the aftermath.
So that told them they needed to look closely at who had access or control after the crime occurred. Interesting.
Then there was Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, another critical interview discussed in the book.
His case really shone a light on the link between early childhood trauma, his mother's intense hatred of being locked in the basement, told he was dangerous, and how that violence escalated, didn't it?
Absolutely. They saw this clear pattern, killing animals, mutilating dolls, building up to the murders, and the role of fantasy in possessing his victims.
And this is where they started really solidifying observations around what the book calls the homicidal triad. A history of cruelty to animals, persistent bedwetting, fire starting.
Right. Behaviors they began seeing as potential red flags, indicators of deep-seated issues with control, empathy, impulse.
And the fact Kemper could so easily fool a psychiatrist, that just underscored why law enforcement needed its own methods for understanding these guys.
Charles Manson offered different insights. The book argues his main driver wasn't some grand messianic vision, but something more basic. Fame, fortune, absolute control.
A master manipulator, using his personality to pick out vulnerable followers, often those with father issues, right?
Yeah. And the surprising insight from the book was that Manson might have actually lost control during the Tate murders, that the extreme brutality was largely led by Tex Watson, not meticulously planned by Manson in that moment.
Which shows that even these highly controlling offenders can see things go off script.
Then David Berkowitz, son of Sam. His case highlighted patterns driven by anger, feelings of inadequacy, especially towards women.
And the key detail learned there, according to the book, was his post-offense behavior, returning to the crime scene to relive the thrill, sometimes acting out the fantasy again.
Exactly. And that insight was incredibly practical. It helped law enforcement strategize surveillance at former crime scenes, a technique that proved useful later on.
The book also notes the irony that Berkowitz himself was confused by the complex psychiatric profiles made from his letters, maybe suggesting their own practical behavior-based approach was more on target.
Interviewing someone like Richard Speck presented challenges. The book mentions wardens, warning them prisoners might throw things, urine, feces.
So they learned they needed different approaches, sometimes having to be more offensive or figure out, as the book puts it, what's going to ring his bell.
Meaning finding the right psychological button to push to get them talking. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all thing.
And Gary Trapnell described as charming. He highlighted the manipulative, almost performative side of some offenders.
Right, the helicopter escape, the bizarre free Angela Davis demand during a hijacking. It wasn't just about escape, it was theater, grabbing attention, manipulating perception.
Arthur Shawcross is another tough case mentioned. Paroled after 15 years for earlier murders, then killed again, raises huge questions about rehabilitation, predicting dangerousness.
The book notes his ability to seem stoic for a jury, but then loosen up with guards. The conclusion wasn't that he was just delusional,
but that he understood right from wrong and chose to kill. That dangerousness isn't always a break from reality. Sometimes it's a conscious choice within a disturbed mind.
And the Thomas Vanda case. The book calls it an object lesson in the disconnect they sometimes found with traditional mental health approaches.
Yeah. The psychiatrist didn't want the crime specifics, thought he was responding nicely to medication and therapy. But by not knowing the behavior, the context of the crime,
they were missing crucial information about his underlying dangerousness. It just reinforced the FBI team's belief that their focus, correlating behavior and crime scene evidence, was uniquely valuable for law enforcement.
So all these really difficult interviews, these observations, they led to the core idea of profiling, right? Methodically correlating what might be going on in the offender's mind with the physical evidence left at the scene.
And understanding that crime scene before it got altered became absolutely critical. This learning drove what the book initially called profiling the cases, seeing patterns across crimes by the same unknown subject.
To understand their behavior, anticipate their next move.
And then applying those patterns proactively. The book gives examples like strategically fortifying banks, maybe leaving one less protected but under intense surveillance.
To sort of funnel a serial bank robber into a trap they predicted he'd fall for based on his known patterns. Clever.
The book also clearly lays out the difference between MO and signature. That was a crucial development.
Right. Modus operandi, that's what the killer has to do to commit the crime successfully. How they get in, subdue the victim, learned behaviors that can change.
But the signature, That's what the killer wants to do. The personal expression, the ritual, the fantasy element. Not necessary for the crime, but fulfills a psychological need. That tends to stay more consistent.
The Stephen Pennell case is cited as a classic example, right? The significant overkill, the posing of victims post-mortem, that signature done not because it was needed to kill, but because it satisfied his specific urges.
Applying these concepts in the field, though, huge challenges, as the book highlights. The Atlanta child murders, for instance,
Right.
profiling victim characteristics, desperation, vulnerability.
And testing proactive ideas like undercover officers offering money, creating visible memorials to see who visited, surveilling rivers. But the book notes the immense difficulties with jurisdiction, analysis paralysis from too much data.
The Trailside Killer case was another where they profiled the UNSUB, the unknown subject, and used proactive traps, like rangers posing as hikers.
But the book acknowledges these attempts weren't always immediately successful. It underscores just how difficult and dangerous this work really was.
Francine Elvison's murder led to a profile for a disorganized offender. Unplanned scene, objects left strangely, a low-risk victim for a high-risk crime.
And there was friction with the police, mentioned in the book. They focused on hair evidence initially, pointing elsewhere.
Yeah, but the FBI team stood by their profile based on the behavioral evidence at the scene.
With Carla Brown, they used publicity and what the book graphically calls the high-ass pucker factor, basically intense public pressure.
And the book details the importance of the re-autopsy for bite mark evidence, analyzing post-offense behavior, absence from work, drinking, weight loss as stress indicators.
The stalking strangler case in Columbus, Georgia, the forces of evil letters that involved profiling the letter writer.
Right. Based on style and content, they profiled him as likely a lone black male, military background trying to divert attention, a key strategic insight.
The attempted murder of Judd Ray. The book calls that a crucial object lesson in misinterpreting behavior.
Analyzing the wife's seemingly distraught behavior before and after the attempt helped reveal it wasn't random. It came from someone trusted. It showed how a contract killing could be staged, emotionally and physically.
The chilling part, as the book notes, is if Judd had died, the wife likely would have gotten away with it. Her performance had prepped everyone.
Then the Mary Frances Brown case. Profiling based on victimology, young, trusting a Terry, and an abduction scene that looked unplanned, opportunistic.
And the book describes using that high-ass pucker factor again and a controversial interrogation technique,
Right.
using victim-blaming language.
Yeah, not to actually blame the victim, but to create a face-saving scenario for the suspect, implying understanding, making it easier to confess.
And finally, the Atlanta prostitute murders. Profiling based on victim-type disposal sites. Using the media to disseminate the profile, initially holding back the racial factor to see who reacted, predicting post-offense behavior.
Stepping back from all these specific cases, the book offers some broader reflections, like on predicting dangerousness.
Yeah. The surprising comparison it makes is to a good elementary school teacher, someone who can often spot troubled kids early.
It emphasizes that recognizing warning signs isn't magic. It requires keen observation of behavior. And it highlights how crucial early intervention and positive adult role models can be.
And maybe the most unexpected part, after detailing so much darkness, is a quote suggesting that needing more love is, quote, at the very heart of the issue in understanding some of these behaviors.
It's a surprising, almost hopeful perspective, isn't it? That while the crimes are horrific, the root might sometimes lie in profound emotional deficits, things that maybe positive influence could address earlier.
The book also tracks the unit's growth from that 1 person to 10, showing the value was eventually recognized. And it stresses maintaining personal contact with local departments, relationships often built through the National Academy.
You know, diving into complex human behavior like this, really drawing on the insights from this book, it takes thoughtful consideration, a willingness to confront some difficult truths.
It really does, and we explore complex topics like these, pulling insights from books and other materials, not just here, but also in our podcasts, and using mindful moments on our YouTube channel. It's all about inspiring that reflection and critical thinking.
So the core takeaway here is really the incredible journey of developing behavioral profiling. It emerged as this critical tool, born from immense personal dedication, even sacrifice.
And from that really difficult but necessary process of learning directly from the darkest aspects of human behavior, it gave law enforcement a systematic way to understand, analyze, and hopefully prevent future tragedies.
And ultimately, that intense focus on understanding the criminal mind, it wasn't just about catching people after the fact. It was fundamentally about protection, about trying to understand the roots of violence, to maybe inform prevention, positive intervention, earlier in people's lives.
A really important distinction.
Yeah. So, if this exploration sparked your curiosity, please subscribe to the show. That way you won't miss future explorations into fascinating topics like this one.
And definitely share this with someone you know who's interested in psychology or true crime or just the incredible complexities of the human mind.
To learn even more, and honestly, to support the work, consider purchasing the book we discussed today. You can find the link in the show notes.
And, reflecting on the immense cost and the resistance involved in developing this vital tool, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other crucial insights might be out there right now, maybe being dismissed or facing similar resistance that could fundamentally change how we understand or tackle other major societal problems. Keep thinking critically.